The transport truck lurched to a stop outside Camp McCoy on a brittle February morning in 1945, and Sergeant Klaus Weber pressed his face against the canvas flap to glimpse his new prison. What he saw made no sense according to everything the Reich had taught him about American brutality toward captured soldiers. Steam rose from multiple chimneys, suggesting heated barracks. Guard towers stood at measured intervals, but the sentries weren't pointing rifles downward. They seemed more interested in stamping their feet against the Wisconsin cold. Weber had been captured 3 weeks earlier during the Ardennes offensive, along with 47 other men from his artillery unit. The journey across the Atlantic had been a blur of seasickness and whispered fears about American prison camps. His bunkmate, Corporal Franz Müller, had spent the voyage reciting horror stories from Nazi briefings about enemy savagery and deliberate starvation of prisoners. "Move it along, boys," Müller muttered, as guards began opening the truck's tailgate. "Remember what they told us about maintaining dignity." But Weber's attention had already shifted to an impossible sight. A guard was handing steaming cups to the prisoners disembarking from the truck ahead of theirs. Not the thin gruel Weber expected, but what appeared to be actual coffee, with real steam rising in the frigid air. One German soldier accepted the cup with trembling hands, and Weber watched the guard nod, just once, but unmistakably human. The processing station inside the camp's main building assaulted Weber with more contradictions. Electric lights blazed overhead, warming the space to an almost luxurious temperature. American soldiers moved efficiently through paperwork, their uniforms clean and well-fitted. Most disturbing of all was the smell, not the stench of overcrowding and poor sanitation Weber had been told to expect, but the rich aroma of cooking meat drifting from what could only be the mess hall. "Name and unit," said the processing clerk, a young private who couldn't have been older than 19. His tone was bored rather than cruel. "Weber, Klaus." "Sergeant, 12th Artillery Regiment," Weber replied in halting English learned during gymnasium years that felt like another lifetime. The private stamped several forms without looking up, then handed Weber a metal disc with a number. "Barracks 7, Bunk 12. Meal formation at 1700 hours. Keep the tag with you always." Weber expected to be shoved or struck. That's what the briefings had promised. Instead, the private simply gestured toward the door, where another guard waited to escort the new arrivals to their quarters. As they walked across the compound, Weber noticed prisoners from earlier transports moving freely between buildings, some carrying work tools, others heading toward what appeared to be a recreation area. Müller grabbed his arm. "This is deliberate," he whispered. "They're softening us up before the real interrogation begins." But Weber was watching a German prisoner emerge from the mess hall, carrying a tray loaded with more food than Weber had seen in months. The man's uniform was clean, his face fuller than any soldier Weber remembered from the last weeks of fighting. When their eyes met, the prisoner gave an almost imperceptible shake of his head, not warning, but something more complex Weber couldn't yet interpret. The barracks themselves delivered the final shock of Weber's first day. Actual beds with mattresses, not straw pallets on concrete. Blankets that appeared to have been manufactured this decade. Windows with real glass that let in afternoon light. Weber sat heavily on his assigned bunk and tried to reconcile this reality with everything he'd been taught about American treatment of German soldiers. "They want us to forget who we are," Müller said, settling onto the neighboring bunk. "Make us comfortable, so we'll betray secrets." Weber nodded, but his mind was elsewhere. Through the window, he could see American guards changing shifts, laughing at some shared joke as they passed each other. One stopped to light his companion's cigarette, a gesture so casual and friendly it seemed to mock every propaganda film Weber had ever watched about the enemy's mechanized cruelty. As evening approached and the dinner formation was called, Weber found himself walking toward the mess hall with a mixture of hunger and deep unease. If the Americans were truly as brutal as he'd been taught, why did his stomach feel safer than it had in months? And if they weren't brutal, what did that say about everything else he'd been told to believe about this war? If stories like this make you question what you do in someone else's boots, tell us in the comments how you imagine you'd react in this camp. And stay with us for the next chapters. The mess hall line moved with an efficiency that would have impressed Weber's former commanding officers, but it was the abundance that left him speechless. Real plates instead of tin cups, portions that filled the entire dish, meat, potatoes, vegetables that looked fresh rather than pickled. When Weber reached the serving station, the American cook didn't just dump food onto his plate, he actually asked a question. "Hungry, buddy?" Weber nodded, uncertain how to respond to such casual concern from an enemy soldier. The cook added another ladle of stew and handed him something Weber hadn't seen in over a year, a bottle of Coca-Cola, the glass still cold enough to fog in the warm air. The dark liquid inside seemed to capture electric light from the overhead bulbs, making it glow like some symbol of American abundance Weber had only heard described in bitter speeches about capitalist excess. At a corner table, Weber sat beside Möller and 3 other recent arrivals, all staring at their trays with the same mixture of gratitude and guilt. The Coca-Cola bottle felt substantial in Weber's hand, real glass, not the ersatz materials that had characterized everything in Germany for the past 2 years. When he finally worked up courage to taste it, the sweetness was almost overwhelming. "It's like drinking liquid candy," whispered Private Koch, a boy from Bavaria who'd been captured during the same offensive. "How do they have so much sugar?" Muller's jaw was tight with disapproval. "They're trying to make us forget rationing back home. Make us think abundance is normal, so we'll be grateful to our captors." But Weber was studying the American guards scattered throughout the mess hall, eating the same food as the prisoners. Not superior rations, identical portions, the same stew, the same Coca-Cola bottles. If this was psychological warfare, it was remarkably expensive and oddly democratic. After dinner, Weber experienced his first work detail assignment. He'd expected punishment labor, but found himself assigned to the camp's maintenance crew alongside Corporal Ernst Hoffmann, a veteran who'd been at McCoy since November. As they walked toward the workshop, Hoffmann provided a whispered orientation that contradicted everything Weber thought he knew about prisoner-of-war camps. "The guards aren't cruel, but they're not soft either," Hoffmann explained. "They follow their rules. We follow ours. Most important rule, don't trust Müller's theories about psychological warfare. Some of us have been here long enough to know this is just how Americans live." The workshop itself was heated and well lit, with tools in better condition than what Weber had used in his pre-war apprenticeship. The supervising sergeant, a middle-aged man with paint-stained fingers, demonstrated the day's task, repairing window frames damaged by winter weather, then left Weber and Hoffmann to work largely unsupervised. "Sergeant Murphy," Hoffmann said, nodding toward the departing supervisor, "lost his son at Normandy, but he's never taken it out on German prisoners. Sometimes he shows us pictures of the boy." Weber spent the afternoon sanding window frames and trying to process this information. In the Reich's version of reality, enemy soldiers were motivated purely by hatred and revenge. But Sergeant Murphy had stopped by twice to check their work, offering practical suggestions in a tone that suggested competence mattered more than nationality. The day's most unsettling moment came during the afternoon break, when Murphy pulled a leather wallet from his pocket and extracted a photograph. Without preamble, he showed it to Weber, a young man in American uniform, grinning at the camera with Murphy's same broad features. "Tommy," Murphy said simply, 19 when he was killed. Would have been your age, I think." Weber stared at the photograph, uncertain what response was expected. The young soldier looked like boys Weber had known in his own unit, with the same mixture of confidence and innocence that war systematically destroyed. Murphy was studying Weber's face with curious intensity, as if trying to determine whether German soldiers were capable of recognizing loss when they saw it. "I'm sorry," Weber managed in careful English, and was surprised to discover he meant it. Murphy nodded once and returned the wallet to his pocket. For the remainder of the afternoon, he worked alongside Weber and Hoffman, explaining techniques for fitting window frames against Wisconsin weather patterns. The casual collaboration felt more subversive than any political lecture Weber had ever attended. That evening, as Weber lay in his heated barracks, listening to Müller's continued theories about American deception, he found himself remembering the taste of Coca-Cola and the weight of real tools in his hands. More troubling was the memory of Murphy's son, grinning from a photograph that suggested American boys died with the same naive hope as German ones. Through the window, Weber could see guards making their evening rounds, their flashlight beams cutting through February darkness. Tomorrow would bring another work detail, another mess hall meal, another day of trying to reconcile propaganda with lived experience. The Coca-Cola bottle sat empty on his footlocker, catching moonlight like a small monument to contradictions Weber wasn't yet ready to examine too closely. March arrived with news that made Weber's stomach clench with homesickness and dread. Letters from Germany had finally caught up to the prisoners at Camp McCoy, carried by Red Cross representatives who distributed mail with the solemnity of funeral directors. Weber's packet contained 3 letters from his mother in Hamburg, each one thinner and more desperate than the last. The February letter, written before Weber's capture, described rationing that had reduced families to turnip soup and ersatz bread. The March letter mentioned bombing raids with increasing frequency, and Weber could read between his mother's careful words the reality of a city slowly starving under Allied pressure. But it was the final letter, dated only 2 weeks earlier, that left Weber staring at the paper with growing anguish. "Klaus, we heard rumors that prisoners in America are fed well, and I pray this reaches you safely. Your father grows weaker each day, and the doctor says there is little to be done without proper food. We have not seen real meat in months, and the chocolate ration ended before Christmas. Please remember that we love you and that we understand whatever you must do to survive. Your mother." Weber read the letter 3 times before its full implications settled into his conscience. While his family survived on turnip scraps, he had eaten beef stew and drunk Coca-Cola every day for 3 weeks. The abundance that had initially shocked him now felt like a betrayal of everyone he'd left behind in the Reich. Müller found him that evening, sitting alone in the recreation area with the letters spread across a wooden table. "My family is eating better than yours," Müller said grimly. "But they're all describing the same collapse. Cities without fuel, factories without workers, children without milk. We're eating like kings while our people starve," Weber replied. "What does that make us?" "It makes us prisoners who've been given no choice," Müller said, but his voice carried less conviction than usual. "Though I notice some of the men are starting to write letters home about camp conditions, describing American food, American heating, American kindness. Those letters will be read by censors and used for propaganda." Weber had been planning to write exactly such a letter, if only to reassure his mother that he was surviving. But Müller's words made him realize the impossible position every prisoner faced: tell the truth about American treatment and provide enemy propaganda, or lie about their conditions and leave families to imagine worse suffering than actually existed. The moral complexity deepened during that week's Red Cross inspection. Inspector Helen Morrison was a precise woman in her 50s who moved through the camp with a clipboard and the kind of systematic thoroughness that suggested nothing escaped her attention. Weber watched her interview prisoners, guards, and camp administrators with equal intensity. When Morrison spoke with Weber, her questions revealed how unusual Camp McCoy's conditions actually were. On a scale of 1 to 10, how would you rate the adequacy of your food rations, your medical care, your treatment by guards? Weber found himself giving answers that would have sounded like propaganda if spoken by an American. Sufficient food, adequate medical care, fair treatment. Morrison recorded his responses without visible reaction, but Weber noticed she spent extra time documenting the mess hall procedures and interviewing Sergeant Murphy about workshop conditions. "Most camps aren't like this one," she told Weber during a follow-up conversation. "Colonel Harrison runs McCoy according to Geneva Convention requirements, but with interpretations that are more generous than strictly necessary. You should understand that your experience here may not represent typical prisoner of war conditions." That revelation left Weber with even more complex feelings about his captivity. If Morrison was correct, then Camp McCoy represented American decency at its most deliberate and thoughtful, not casual abundance, but carefully chosen humanity, which meant Weber was experiencing the enemy at their best, making his comfort feel both more precious and more morally difficult to accept. The week's defining moment came during a conversation with Corporal Hoffman, who had received letters from his wife in Dresden. Hoffman's hands shook as he described Allied bombing that had reduced his neighborhood to ash and rubble. His wife and children had survived, but were living in a basement shelter with 30 other families. "I eat hamburgers while my children sleep on stone floors," Hoffman said. "How do I write letters about this place without betraying everyone I love?" Weber had no answer, but that evening he noticed something that complicated his feelings even further. Sergeant Murphy was sitting alone in the guard break area, reading what appeared to be a letter of his own. When he finished, Murphy carefully folded the paper and sat staring out at the Wisconsin farmland with an expression of profound sadness. Later, through fragmented conversation with Hoffman, Weber learned that Murphy had received news about his brother's unit, heavy casualties during the crossing of the Rhine, names that would never come home to families who were probably writing letters about rationing and worry and hopes for American boys fighting in foreign countries. Weber realized that both sides of the barbed wire were receiving mail that described loss, hunger, and fear. The difference was abundance. American families worried about sons while cooking with real butter and sugar, while German families worried about sons while surviving on turnips and ersatz coffee. But the worry itself was identical, and that recognition made Weber's comfortable captivity feel even more morally complicated. Do you think you'd cling to what you were taught back home, or to what your own eyes see in a place like this? Comment which side you'd lean toward, and share this episode with someone who loves real human stories from history. April brought warmth to Wisconsin, and with it a work detail assignment that would challenge everything Weber thought he understood about the nature of enemy soldiers. He was assigned to assist the camp's medical officer, Dr. Sarah Chen, a second-generation Chinese-American whose family had been interned in California before she volunteered for military service. The irony of her situation, an American citizen imprisoned by her own government, now treating enemy prisoners with more care than many of them had received in their own army, was not lost on Weber. Dr. Chen's clinic operated with the efficiency that impressed Weber, but more surprising was her approach to treating German prisoners. When Private Koch developed a severe respiratory infection, Dr. Chen spent 40 minutes examining him and explaining treatment options in careful, broken German she'd been learning from a dictionary. She prescribed real medicine, not aspirin substitutes, but actual sulfur drugs that Weber knew were rationed even for American civilians. "Doctor," Weber asked during one of his shifts organizing medical supplies, "why do you treat enemy soldiers the same as American patients?" "Doctor." Chen looked up from the chart she was reviewing. "Because infection doesn't recognize nationality, and neither should medicine. Also because I've seen what happens when governments decide some people deserve less care than others." Weber understood she was referring to her internment experience, and the parallel to his own situation was uncomfortable but unmistakable. They were both products of governments that had classified certain groups as inherently suspicious or dangerous, regardless of individual behavior or loyalty. The medical work gave Weber access to conversations and observations that deepened his understanding of Camp McCoy's moral complexity. He learned that Sergeant Murphy volunteered for extra shifts specifically to supervise German prisoners, not from suspicion, but from a belief that productive work helped men maintain dignity during captivity. Murphy had requested the assignment after learning that his son Tommy had been treated well by German medics before dying from wounds sustained at Normandy. Weber also discovered that the abundance he'd initially attributed to American excess was actually the result of deliberate policy decisions. Colonel Harrison had studied German treatment of American prisoners and decided to exceed Geneva Convention requirements as both moral imperative and practical psychology. Well-fed prisoners required fewer guards and created fewer disciplinary problems. The most revealing conversation came during a late afternoon shift when Dr. Chen was treating a German sergeant who'd been injured during a work detail. The sergeant, a veteran named Braun, had been captured in North Africa and held in American camps for over 2 years. His perspective on captivity carried the weight of long experience. "The Americans are dangerous," Braun told Weber, while Dr. Chen bandaged his hand. "Not because they're cruel, but because they make you forget what you were fighting for. They feed you, treat your injuries, respect your rank. After 2 years of this, I remember American kindness better than I remember why I hated America." Dr. Chen glanced up from her work. "Is that necessarily a bad thing?" Braun considered the question seriously. "For a soldier, maybe. For a man with a conscience, probably not. But it makes going home complicated when your family expects you to return full of hatred for enemies who saved your life." That evening, Weber wrote his first letter home since arriving at Camp McCoy. After weeks of agonizing over what to tell his mother, he chose careful honesty. He described adequate food and medical care, fair treatment by guards, and work assignments that maintained his skills and dignity. He mentioned the Coca-Cola only once as an example of small luxuries that made captivity bearable. What he didn't mention was the growing realization that American soldiers were as homesick, worried, and human as German ones. He didn't describe Sergeant Murphy's photographs or Dr. Chen's patient explanations of medical procedures. He certainly didn't admit that he'd begun looking forward to work shifts and conversations with guards who treated him as a competent adult rather than a dangerous enemy. Müller found the letter before Weber could mail it and confronted him in the barracks. "This reads like propaganda for the enemy," Müller said. "You're describing treatment that will make families think we've abandoned our principles." "I'm describing reality," Weber replied. "If that sounds like propaganda, maybe we should examine what we were told to expect." Their argument drew attention from other prisoners, and Weber realized the camp's social dynamics were more complex than he'd initially understood. Roughly half the men shared Müller's determination to maintain ideological purity and resist American attempts at psychological manipulation. The other half, led by veterans like Braun and Hoffman, had concluded that survival required acknowledgement of moral complexity that propaganda had never addressed. The division came to a head when Dr. Chen asked for volunteers to assist with a medical emergency. An American guard had suffered a heart attack during night duty, and she needed help moving equipment quickly. Weber volunteered immediately, along with Hoffman and 2 other prisoners. Miller watched from across the compound with an expression of profound disapproval. Working alongside Dr. Chen and American medics to stabilize the guard felt like the most natural thing Weber had done since capture. Medical emergencies created their own moral universe where competence mattered more than nationality, and Weber found himself thinking more clearly about right and wrong than he had in months. Later, as he cleaned medical instruments while the guard was transported to a civilian hospital, Dr. Chen made an observation that would haunt Weber for the remainder of his captivity. "You worked well tonight," she said, "like someone who understands that saving lives matters more than politics. That's either very dangerous thinking for a prisoner of war or very healthy thinking for a human being. Weber nodded, uncertain which interpretation he preferred, but increasingly sure that his time at Camp McCoy was changing him in ways that would make returning to his old life more complicated than he'd ever imagined. The discovery that would redefine Weber's understanding of Camp McCoy came through the most mundane circumstance possible: cleaning Dr. Chen's office after hours. While organizing supply cabinets, Weber found a folder marked prisoner medical records that had been misfiled behind boxes of bandages. Inside were detailed charts tracking the health improvements of German prisoners during their time at the camp. What Weber read made him sit heavily in Dr. Chen's chair, his hands trembling as he processed the implications. Average weight gain among prisoners, 37 pounds during the first 6 months of captivity. Incidence of vitamin deficiency diseases reduced from 68% upon arrival to 0 after 3 months. Dental problems improved, respiratory infections treated successfully, chronic conditions managed with medicine many German soldiers had never seen during active duty. The most devastating document was a comparative study Dr. Chen had compiled using data from other camps. Camp McCoy's prisoner mortality rate was 0. Not a single German soldier had died during captivity. The average across American prisoner of war facilities was 0.15%, already remarkably low by international standards. But McCoy's complete success in keeping enemy soldiers alive and healthy represented something approaching medical miracle. Weber understood immediately why this information was classified. These statistics would serve as devastating propaganda against the Reich's claims about American brutality toward prisoners. More personally troubling, they forced Weber to confront the reality that he was healthier, better fed, and more secure than he'd been at any point during his military service, including training periods before combat deployment. The folder also contained Dr. Chen's correspondence with military superiors, requesting authorization to use Camp McCoy as a model for prisoner treatment throughout the American system. Her letters argued that humane conditions weren't just moral imperatives, but practical advantages. Healthy prisoners required less medical attention, created fewer disciplinary problems, and provided more reliable intelligence during authorized interviews. Weber was still reading when Dr. Chen entered the office to collect supplies for her evening rounds. She found him holding her correspondence, his face pale with the shock of full understanding about his situation. "You weren't supposed to see those files," she said calmly, but without anger, "though I suppose it was inevitable. Men as intelligent as you eventually notice patterns in their treatment." "We're not just prisoners," Weber said. "We're subjects in an experiment about whether enemies can be transformed through kindness." Dr. Chen sat across from him, her expression thoughtful rather than defensive. "That's one interpretation. Another is that we're simply treating human beings like human beings and documenting what happens when basic decency replaces institutional cruelty." "But it is deliberate," Weber pressed. "The abundance, the medical care, the respect. You're proving that American values produce better results than German methods." "Yes," Dr. Chen admitted. "And also proving that German soldiers respond to humane treatment exactly the way American soldiers would, which suggests that national character might be less important than individual conscience." Weber set down the folder, his mind racing through implications he'd been avoiding for weeks. If Dr. Chen was correct, then his positive response to American treatment reflected universal human needs rather than personal betrayal of German principles. But that interpretation required accepting that the Reich's ideology about national character and racial hierarchy was fundamentally false. The conversation was interrupted by a commotion outside, shouting voices and running feet that suggested medical emergency. Dr. Chen grabbed her kit and rushed toward the disturbance, with Weber following instinctively. they found a crowd gathered around Corporal Müller, who had collapsed in the compound's central area. As Dr. Chen examined Müller, Weber learned from other prisoners that his collapse had followed the arrival of his first letter from home in over 3 months. The letter, still clutched in Müller's hand, described the destruction of his family's farm during Soviet advance and his parents' death during the refugee evacuation. Müller's rigid ideology had sustained him through capture and captivity, but news of irreversible loss had finally broken his psychological defenses. Dr. Chen worked quickly to stabilize Müller, administering sedatives and checking vital signs while American guards cleared space for privacy. But Weber noticed something that complicated his feelings even further. The guards' expressions showed genuine concern for Müller's well-being, despite his open hostility toward American personnel throughout his captivity. "He'll recover physically," Dr. Chen told Weber as they transported Müller to the medical barracks. "But psychological trauma requires different treatment than medical conditions. Sometimes grief has to be processed before healing can begin." Over the following days, Weber found himself visiting Müller regularly, partly from friendship, but also from morbid curiosity about how ideological conviction withstood personal devastation. Müller's responses revealed the cost of maintaining absolute beliefs in an absolutely complex world. "They killed my parents while Americans fed me hamburgers," Müller said during one of Weber's visits. "How do I live with that knowledge? How do I hate my captors when they're treating my medical crisis better than my own army treated combat injuries?" Weber had no answer, but he understood that Müller's crisis represented an extreme version of the moral conflict every prisoner at Camp McCoy had to navigate. The discovery of Dr. Chen's files had simply made explicit what Weber had been avoiding. Their treatment wasn't accidental kindness, but deliberate demonstration that enemies could be transformed through systematic decency. The most troubling realization was that the transformation was working. Weber cared about Dr. Chen's welfare, respected Sergeant Murphy's professionalism, and looked forward to work assignments that made him feel useful rather than simply contained. These weren't political conversions, but human responses to being treated as a person rather than a category. That night, Weber sat in the recreation area with the empty Coca-Cola bottle he'd saved from his first meal at Camp McCoy. The bottle had become his private symbol of abundance and moral confusion, a reminder that his enemies possessed luxuries his family couldn't imagine, but had chosen to share them with men who'd been trying to kill American soldiers months earlier. The sweetness of that first Coca-Cola had been overwhelming after years of ersatz everything. Now Weber understood that the sweetness hadn't been purely physical, but psychological. The taste of being treated as worthy of small pleasures despite his status as enemy prisoner. That kindness was harder to process than cruelty would have been because it required accepting moral complexity that his ideological training had never addressed. Weber's repatriation came in June 1945, 3 weeks after Germany's surrender and 4 months after his arrival at Camp McCoy. The morning of departure, Dr. Chen gave him a final medical examination and a document that would complicate his homecoming in ways neither of them fully anticipated. "This is your medical record," she explained, handing him a manila envelope. "Documentation that you received proper care according to Geneva Convention standards. You'll need it for your debriefing and pension applications." Weber understood the subtext. Proof that American treatment had exceeded international requirements would serve as evidence against Nazi claims about enemy brutality. Carrying Dr. Chen's records home meant bringing testimony that contradicted everything his family and community had been taught to believe about American character. The transport convoy assembled in the camp's central area, where prisoners lined up according to regional destinations. Weber found himself standing beside Hoffman and 3 other men who would be traveling to the same processing center in northern Germany. Muller, still recovering from his psychological crisis, had been placed on an earlier transport for prisoners requiring extended medical supervision. Sergeant Murphy approached the group with a cardboard box containing personal items the prisoners had accumulated during captivity. When he handed Weber his possessions, Murphy included something unexpected: a glass Coca-Cola bottle, empty but carefully cleaned, along with a brief note. "Thought you might want to remember what American hospitality tastes like," the note read. "Hope your family is safe and your country finds peace. Sergeant J. Murphy." Weber stared at the bottle, recognizing it as the same one from his first meal at Camp McCoy. Murphy had somehow saved it for 4 months, understanding its symbolic importance before Weber had fully grasped it himself. The gesture felt like a final lesson in American decency that made Weber's departure emotionally complex rather than simply joyful. The convoy's route took them through small Wisconsin towns, where civilians gathered to watch the departing prisoners. Weber expected hostile faces or celebrating crowds, but found mostly curiosity and what appeared to be relief that the war was ending without requiring further violence. In one town, an elderly woman threw small wrapped candies to prisoners through the transport truck's canvas openings, a gesture so unexpected that several German soldiers began crying openly. Hoffman, sitting beside Weber, unwrapped one of the candies and shook his head in wonder. "Even their civilians show us kindness." How do we explain this to people who've been told Americans are monsters? Weber had no answer, but he was beginning to understand that repatriation would require confronting questions more complex than simple homecoming joy. The Germany they were returning to had been devastated by 4 years of total war, while they had spent recent months being fed, sheltered, and treated with respect by the enemy. That contrast would create social tensions no one had prepared them to navigate. The Atlantic crossing took 8 days, during which Weber had extended conversations with prisoners from camps throughout the American system. Their experiences varied considerably. Some reported conditions barely meeting Geneva Convention minimums. Others described treatment approaching Camp McCoy's generous standards. Weber realized his captivity had been unusually humane, making his testimony both more valuable and more difficult to share. The most revealing conversation came with a former U-boat commander who'd been captured in 1943 and held at camps in Texas and Colorado. "The Americans aren't uniform in their decency," the commander told Weber. "Some guards are cruel, some are kind, most are simply doing jobs. But their system prevents the worst abuses and sometimes produces genuine compassion. That's more than we provided Allied prisoners and more than we deserved as enemies." When the transport ship reached Hamburg's destroyed harbor, Weber saw for the first time the full scope of Germany's defeat. The port facilities were rubble, the surrounding city reduced to skeletal ruins that suggested systematic destruction rather than military targeting. American occupation forces were directing reconstruction efforts with the same methodical efficiency Weber had observed at Camp McCoy. But the scale of required rebuilding seemed almost impossible. The initial processing station for returning prisoners was a tent city where German civilians worked alongside Allied personnel to document repatriation and provide basic medical services. Weber's first conversation with a fellow German civilian in over a year came when a Red Cross volunteer asked about his treatment during captivity. "Were you mistreated?" the volunteer asked, preparing to document any violations of international law. Weber hesitated, understanding that his answer would become part of official records that might influence post-war negotiations and future prisoner exchanges. "No," he said finally. "I was treated better than I expected, and better than I probably deserved." The volunteer looked surprised, as if she'd been prepared for complaints rather than grudging gratitude. Weber realized his response contradicted the narrative many Germans had constructed about American brutality to justify their own wartime actions. His reunion with his mother came 3 days later, in their partially rebuilt neighborhood where she'd been living in a single room since their house was destroyed during bombing raids. Weber's appearance shocked her. He was heavier and healthier than when he'd left for military service, clearly better fed than she'd been during his absence. "Klaus," she said, holding him with trembling hands, "you looked like the war didn't touch you." Weber understood immediately that his healthy appearance would require explanation, and that explanation would force his mother to confront uncomfortable truths about the enemy's character. Over the following weeks, he shared carefully edited stories about Camp McCoy, emphasizing adequate food and fair treatment while downplaying the abundance that had characterized his daily experience. The hardest conversation came when his mother asked directly about American soldiers' behavior toward German prisoners. Weber found himself describing Sergeant Murphy's kindness, Dr. Chen's medical care, and the overall respect he'd received from guards and camp personnel. His mother listened with growing confusion and what appeared to be grief. "If the Americans treated you so well," she asked finally, "what does that say about what we were told about them? And what does it say about how we treated their soldiers?" Weber had no answer that wouldn't shatter beliefs his mother needed to maintain her sense of moral coherence during Reconstruction. But that night, alone in his childhood bedroom that now felt smaller than his Camp McCoy bunk, Weber took out the Coca-Cola bottle Murphy had given him and tried to process the weight of carrying kindness as memory. Years later, when Weber had rebuilt his life and started his own family, he would tell his children carefully edited stories about American captivity that emphasized survival rather than comfort. But he kept Murphy's bottle on his desk as a private reminder that enemies had chosen decency when they could have chosen cruelty, and that witness to such decency created moral obligations that lasted long after wars ended. The bottle's glass still caught light the way it had in Camp McCoy's mess hall, still reminded Weber of sweetness that had been overwhelming after years of deprivation. But now it also represented the difficult truth that kindness from unexpected sources could be harder to carry than hatred, because it required acknowledging the humanity of people you'd been taught to see as monsters. If this story reminded you that even in the darkest times, small acts of humanity still matter, subscribe to the channel, tell us which country you watch from, and invite someone to revisit history with us in the next story.